It is the trade deadline, and we have got you rocking and rolling here on Locked On Grizzlies with all the Grizzlies buzz. Memphis made a trade. Xavier Tillman Sr., no longer a member of the Memphis Grizzlies, now a Boston Celtic. We're going to break that down for you. Plus, we're going to discuss other Grizzlies that may be on the move. It may not be over just yet. And we've also got bold trade deadline predictions around the league. All that and more. Damichael Cole and I on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is a special trade deadline edition of Locked On Grizzlies. I am one of your hosts, Joe Mullinax, and it's always a good day when I can say one of your hosts because that means I'm joined by my wonderful partner, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He's the Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. Damichael, I'm happy to have you with us, and I'm happy to have you, dear listener, dear viewer, with us as well on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Locked On Grizzlies is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe on Apple, Spotify. Also check us out on YouTube. 3,000 followers and counting. We are very proud of that number, proud of the growth in Locked On Grizzlies, and proud to have so many everydayers that shout us out in the comments, letting us know where they're listening from, how they're checking out the show. We've gotten lots of good feedback in the last few days, and Damichael and I appreciate that. Damichael, this is one of those episodes that kind of writes themselves, right? Yeah. Obviously, lots of trade deadline speculation and rumors going around, but the Grizzlies did something definite. On Wednesday, they send out Xavier Tillman Sr. to the Boston Celtics in exchange for 2 second-round picks. And when I did our Locked On Now, because we're supposed to get this content out pretty quick, Damichael, I talked about the second-round picks, and I said, I wonder what the Grizzlies are going to do with that open roster spot. It was later revealed that the second-round picks were not traveling alone from Boston. They were going to have some company. Whether or not he sticks around, Lamar Stevens, is another question. But the official trade, 2 second-round picks, I think one in 2027 and one in 2030. Those are the stars of the show, but Lamar Stevens, for salary matching purposes, coming to Memphis. We'll see if he sticks or not. Xavier Tillman Sr., the star in terms of contributing basketball player, heading off to Boston. It's a pretty sweet deal for X. I'm sure he's bummed out that he's leaving the place that drafted him, but at the same time, he gets to go from a team that's going to the lottery to a team that might be going to the NBA Finals.
Yeah, it's always two parts to these things. Of course, on the court perspective, Xavier Tillman Sr. going to Boston, a defensive-minded team, where his role will be his role. You know, he won't be asked to score 10, 15, 20 points or anything of the sort. He'll just be there to defend at a high level, and he'll have plenty of scoring, whether it's Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Derek White. We saw him shoot the ball from beyond the arc, Drew Holiday. He'll have a lot of scoring around him. So a nice fit for him. And now Grizzlies fans, you kind of have someone, you know, you're not going to be on the playoffs this year more than likely, but you got someone to cheer for kind of from afar, along with, you know, Mike Conley and, guys like that. So that's one part of it. And, you know, we talked about it on here as well, Joe, about the idea of, you know, if you can move Xavier Tillman for second-round picks, you do it, because at the end of the day, it seems very unlikely at this point that he was going to be re-signed. I remember we talked to him. I talked to him before, around the beginning of the season, and he basically said that there were some extension talks, you know, with the Grizzlies, but not much. So you kind of got the sense at that point that a contract extension wasn't to come. He was going to have to play this season out. And with the way that this season has went, the writing kind of became on the wall. But there's the human part of it too, where, you know, when you get to know these guys and you be around them a lot, Xavier Tillman, and I know we say this a lot of times when guys get moved, but yes, it was the same way with Tyus, and I really mean it with X too. They were both just two of the best guys in that Grizzlies locker room. I mean, Xavier Tillman Sr. was a guy I could always go up to. And you from a reporter's perspective, you miss those guys who really give you the real, as I like to say. Xavier Tillman was a guy I could go to and say, what do you think about the rebounding right now? And he's not going to say, oh, we just got to keep working at it. We got to get better. There were times he straight up told me, Joe, we suck at it right now. I mean, his words. He said, we suck at it right now. I'm like, well, what do you have to do? And he would break it down. Hey, when this guy goes to get the rebound, this guy has to come from this side to help him out. And it's easy as a reporter to kind of relay that information to our viewers here, or whether it's my content and commercial appeal. So it's like, you miss those type of players because that's not every player. And Xavier Tillman is one of those guys. We know the family aspect. He's Xavier Tillman Sr. at his 25-year-old young age. But yes, he has kids. And the guy is super family man. Like he is probably as family man as they come at his age. And just to put it in perspective, I'm sure some of you saw the interview. I forget who the Grizzlies reporter was. I believe it was Kelsey Wright. It may have been Jessica Benson, but it was Jessica Benson, I believe. But somewhere in the grind media, Laura asked Xavier Tillman Sr. if he could have dinner with one person dead or alive, who would it be? And you listen to it, Joe. Most of the players will say, "Oh, Barack Obama, Jay-Z, Tupac." The typical answers. Someone like Nelson Mandela or something like that. You know what Xavier Tillman said? He said his wife. He said his wife, because he doesn't get to spend much time with her throughout the NBA season. That tells you everything you need to know about the guy. Great guy. He was a great locker room guy with the Grizzlies. Everyone, if you don't know, I mean, I saw it firsthand. Him and Jaren were oh so close. Like literally one of the last moments we had in the locker room with him and Jaren was we were joking about the fact that he didn't name Jaren the godfather, of his kids, of any of his kids. And X is like, oh, him, Godfather? Like, Jaren, he's like a big kid. So he's like, him, Godfather, please. And Jaren's talking, oh, they love, like him, calling him, say they love him because he's the uncle and all that stuff. So those two are really tight, man. And that's kind of, what you have to think about when you make these moves, because their relationship goes back to Michigan State. And now, they're going to be in different places. But all in all, the Grizzlies, it was always the deal, Joe, is if you trade Xavier Tillman Sr., get something back, get some assets. And it's 2027 to 2030, so it's a while before we see what those become. But at the end of the day, you didn't let him leave after this season for nothing.
And for a team that, obviously you hope the salary cap will continue to go up as the NBA is successful. There's talk of expansion, those sorts of things. You're going to have to keep paying John Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr., and they're going to keep getting paid more and more money. Like, we'll eventually talk about these three guys like they're talking about Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green in terms of money. Like, are they going to take pay cuts and things like that to stay competitive? We're not there yet, obviously, but my point is those second-round picks, they could be trade fodder. They also could just be a way to build your roster when you have three max contract guys on your roster still in 2030 potentially, because we have to remember in 2030, John Morant's going to be 30, 31. Yep. Same thing with Jaren. Dez will be 32. Like, they'll still be.
That's roughly back end of your prime. Yeah.
Correct. So it's not like it's that crazy to say they're going to need second rounders to help fill out a roster. I thought it was good value for Boston too, to be honest with you. It's one of those trades that, there doesn't have to be a winner and a loser. I think the Celtics get somebody who's very good at something very unique, but something that Boston desperately needed. There are a few guys in the NBA that can be classified as bigs that can legitimately say that they have had the opportunity to defend both Nikola Jokic and LeBron James and do so in an admirable way. He certainly isn't stopping those guys, because who's stopping LeBron and Jokic? But if you watch the game, and Denver Nuggets people pointed this out, people that cover the Lakers, this is a smart pickup by Boston. It's a very specific skill set. He's a guy that series to series, you need to slow down Joel Embiid in the second round.
Karl Anthony Towns,
Karl Anthony Towns, whatever the case might be, Tillman can do that better than a Porzingis, better than an Al Horford at this stage of his career. You can put X out there, and he can give you that effort. So like you said, a specific role for him. I think that's going to be wonderful to see. It's great that he has a chance to compete for a championship. And then he's going to be a free agent, and he'll probably be in the mid-level exception kind of realm for money. Memphis, clearly, we've talked a lot about Brandon Clark here on Locked On Grizzlies. I don't think that they're concerned about the Achilles. I think they're thinking he's going to be just fine. Otherwise, they wouldn't have traded away basically their two centers on the roster. I think they think Brandon Clarke's going to be back sooner rather than later, which is, exciting news if you're a Grizzlies fan. But Xavier Tillman may not be the only Grizzly that's going to be on the move, right? There's still trade deadline possibilities. Obviously, the risk that you run recording a daily podcast is that the episode might be moot at 7 a.m. But at the same time, we're going to talk about other names that could be potentially on the move coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Nissan. Nissan has an amazing, amazing product that's for all of our listeners, and you should consider giving it a shot, especially if you're the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further. Have you ever wondered what adventure could be around the corner coming up next? If you've ever been in that boat, our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level, like the 2024 Nissan Rogue, the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder, the 2024 Nissan Armada. Especially the Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. You can go with a class exclusive Google built-in that is always updating assistance to call on for anything that you could possibly think of just about. The Pathfinder has 284 horsepower, up to 6,000 pounds of towing. So many options with Nissan. Make sure you're checking out the Nissan Rogue, the Nissan Pathfinder, the Nissan Armada. Take either of those and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, other Memphis players that might be on the move. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I'm Joe Mullinax, joined by Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He's the Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. You should already be following Damichael on X. If you don't, you most certainly need to here in trade deadline season at Damichael C. You can follow me on X at Joe Mullinax. We're excited to have you with us here on this special edition of Locked On Grizzlies. And Damichael, Xavier Tillman is gone. We wish him well. As you mentioned earlier in the show, really a solid dude all around. I can relate to him. You mentioned the interview saying that he would want to have dinner with his wife. I can relate to that, both in terms of being very busy at times and then also having small children. You don't really get very many date nights. So he was probably one of the more relatable Grizzlies players for me in my washed state of life. But he is gone, right? Yeah. John Konchar remains, at least as of this recording. Zaire Williams, Jake LaRavia, David Roddy, all sorts of different names that have been floated in the past that could potentially be on the move for the Grizzlies. Who do we think could be realistically out of Memphis by the time the trade deadline approaches? And what is the end game for Memphis entering this deadline? Because it seems pretty clear to me that they have a very particular goal over the next several hours as the deadline approaches.
Yeah, it's the two words that we've hit on 100 times over now, and it's roster flexibility. We said it before the deadline, and I know people keep throwing out all these dream names, and I don't want to be the Debbie Downer or whatever, but at the end of the day, I've said it from the jump, the summer, the moves that you want to see, be patient for the summer. But right now, it's about roster flexibility. A little move here to create a little cap space, or, move off of the first apron, a luxury tax, whatever the case may be. A little move here to create, a roster spot for you to add something in the offseason. A little add a draft pick here for the future. It's just in case for another future move you want to make. Like, it's all about creating that flexibility right now, because the flexibility was very limited for a team as young as this one. Going into the trade deadline. But with all that being said, Joe, I'm going to hit you with a different one here. It got to hit you from a different angle. Ooh. We got to talk a little bit more about Luke Kennard. And here's where I'm at. Here's where I'm at, because everyone's not going to understand that. But the thing is, we're not talking about what he brings on the floor. Three-point shooting is plus for the Grizzlies. The results, the proof are in the pudding. When he's on the floor with Desmond Bane, John Morant, and those guys, we see the numbers have been productive. But I'm on the record. I've said, to me, if it came down to Steven Adams or Luke Kennard, because you had to move, we knew they had to move one of the bigger contracts. But if it came down to those two, I would have chose to move Kennard. I would have stuck with Steven Adams and kept him as my starting center. But with all that being said, that's not to say that I'm low on Kennard. It's to say that that's the decision. Because check this out. Luke Kennard has a $14.7 million team option that has to be picked up or declined at the end of the season. Declining that team option should not be an option. It's not an option. You either trade him at the deadline, or you say, we're going to pick that option up, and he's going to play with Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and all those guys going into next season. That's the question that the Grizzlies have to answer before 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern time. That is the question that has to be answered. Because let's put it out there like this. Yes, the Grizzlies have moved, some dollars and whatnot. We've already talked about. They're going to be in a luxury tax this upcoming season. They're going to be a tax team, and they're going to be in the tax the year after that. So they're going to be a repeated tax team. But the Grizzlies are going to likely be in the first apron. They're probably going to be hovering somewhere. I doubt they get to the second apron, but they're probably going to be in the first apron. If they want to avoid going into the first apron, and we talked a little bit about the limitations there, and we can get deeper into it on a future episodes, but there are limitations from a team building standpoint if you go in the first apron, and then they get stricter as you go into the second apron of the luxury taps when you just so much above the salary cap. But if you decline Luke Kennard's option, then you're below the first apron a decent amount. Like, you can go into next season as below a first apron team, but declining his team option, like I said, that's not an option. So if that's the mentality of the Grizzlies, there are plenty of teams out there that would love to go get Adam Shooter of his caliber. And that's the decision that the Grizzlies have to battle here, because I've said, look, I think Luke Kennard is a very valuable player to this team. I'm not advocating to trade him because of his performance in any way. This is strictly team building talk. And if you talk about from a value perspective, I believe that you can go get shooters, maybe that won't shoot 40. He led the league in 3-point shooting the last 2 seasons. You can go get quality shooters for much cheaper than $14.5 million a year. We're just being honest, that don't play great defense. Like, it's not like he's, a great elite 3-and-D guy. So with all that being said, Joe, that's the main name. We talked about, John Konchar, Zaire Williams a little bit. Those guys are definitely names to monitor. But I just wanted to know, what do you think about the Luke Kennard one? Because at the end of the day, I don't think it'll happen, but it's something to monitor, because of the situation, the financial situation.
I think Luke Kennard is probably their most tradable asset they have that's realistic. And that was true before Xavier Tillman Sr. got moved. I think if they trade Luke Kennard, they can get a first-round pick for him for all the reasons that you just outlined. I think it was The Athletic that did their trade deadline primer and had Luke Kennard like 15th in their rankings of best potentially available guys. And they made a brief statistical argument that Luke Kennard's one of the top 10 3-point shooters in the history of the NBA. And I would put him maybe 9th or 10th. Yeah. But if you look at the numbers, I mean, in the last 3 years, who's shot the ball better than Luke Kennard from 3? Very few people. So he is someone who is definitely a potential threat if you need spacing, if you need someone on the floor that can create room for other guys to operate. You have to respect Luke Kennard. You can't go under screens on him, and that makes you more predictable in terms of your defensive coverages. I do think that it also could be Kennard, because you need it takes 2 to tango, right? You hear Zach Kleiman say variations of that all the time. It takes 2 to make a deal. We can want to trade Zaire Williams all we want, right? Like, I would love to move on from Zaire and bring in Killian Hayes for all the reasons we've already talked about on recent episodes of Locked On Grizzlies. But if Detroit doesn't want that, it's not going to happen, right? And I think that that's important, that's significant. They are going to make moves that benefit the future more so than the here and now. And if they still believe that they can find something in Zaire or find something in Jake LaRavia, then they're going to give those guys those continued opportunities. I am of the mindset that it's time to move on from those guys. But again, if the Grizzlies are trying to sell on Williams, LaRavia, those types of players, convincing a team like Toronto, the Pistons, the Hornets, the Spurs, the Wizards, getting them to take on those guys, it may not be as easy as one would think. If Memphis fans are so eager to move on from Zaire, what makes you think that a Washington GM person is be like, you know what?
Yeah.
Let's bring that guy in who severely underperformed his lottery selection position. That's just not how it works. So I'm with you on the Kennard idea. I think that there's a lot of possibility there. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out as things go along. And of course, here on Locked On Grizzlies, we did a special mini episode when Kennard was acquired, Damichael, if you remember correctly. If Kennard is dealt or any other major deal, no disrespect to Xavier Tillman, that wasn't necessarily deemed large enough for a mini episode. A trade deadline specific episode on top of this one, if necessary, will come to you on Thursday here on Locked On Grizzlies. So stay on the lookout for that, if there are indeed any other Grizzlies on the move. But when we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are going to discuss other possibilities, trade deadline predictions, other names that have been floated out there that could potentially be on the move. Will Dallas get Andrew Wiggins? What will become of Philadelphia and Andre Drummond? All sorts of different things that could happen. Damichael and I are going to make bold predictions next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, I want to let you know that the NBA trade deadline is not just fast approaching, but Locked On Fantasy Basketball is your place for live reaction starting Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Subscribe to Locked On Fantasy Basketball on YouTube today. Don't miss Josh Lloyd breaking down every NBA trade with analysis and insight you can only get from Locked On Fantasy Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Prize Picks, and I don't know if you knew this or not, Damichael, but it is demon time on Prize Picks. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10, Damichael, into $1,000. And that's thanks to demons and goblins that are the newest and most exciting way to play at Prize Picks. Squares marked with red demons or green goblins get you different payouts. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. It's fantastic to play Prize Picks, selecting players, the stat that you're wanting to focus on, all sorts of different opportunities within Prize Picks itself. And again, those demons and goblins make it all the more fun. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy with Prize Picks. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, closing out the show with some bold NBA trade deadline predictions. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I'm Joe Mullinax, closing out this episode, this trade deadline episode of Locked On Grizzlies with Damichael Cole, the Commercial Appeal, my co-host. He's also the Memphis Grizzlies beat writer over at the Commercial Appeal. Make sure you're following him on X at Damichael C. Follow me on X at Joe Mullinax, heading into the trade deadline and beyond. Damichael, the time has come for some bold predictions. I know you're not as big of a fan of these as me. I like to stand on my soapbox and yell, and I'll be right sometimes, I'll be wrong sometimes. Is there anything that, as you look at the landscape of the NBA, maybe it's a bold Memphis Grizzlies prediction?
Yeah.
But is there anything that, as you look at the scope of the NBA, that you think is almost a lock to happen going into the deadline at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central with the trade deadline?
Yeah, I don't see any stars being moved. I think this is
depending on your definition of star.
Yeah, very much so. But okay, I'll throw a couple names out there. Like let's say DeJounte Murray, for example.
So he's not a star to you.
No, he is.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I think
he's a star.
Same page.
I don't see him being moved despite all the chatter. The Atlanta situation and whatnot. I don't think someone like D'Angelo Russell, is going to be moved. At the deadline. I think this deadline is all about, getting those guys needle movers, as I like to call them. A guy like Tyus Jones. We just saw Monte Morris get traded from Detroit, and now he's going to be the backup to Mike Conley over there, which was a position that the Timberwolves needed to get addressed.
That's good depth. That's a really good trade for Minnesota.
I think those are the type of trades that we're going to see. It's those needle movers, potentially Andre Drummond being moved, wing guys like Torrey Craig, like guys who are just going to fill in. And, probably I think the biggest name that probably will get moved maybe is Miles Bridges. That might be the biggest name to get moved. But I don't really expect any like just big New Year's Eve type fireworks at the deadline. That's my
Fair enough.
bold prediction. Yeah.
I would love to see Tyus Jones in Phoenix because I think that he would be fascinating. I don't know how much defense would be played, but in terms of offensive explosiveness, I would love to see Phoenix somehow get Tyus Jones because there's already the relationship with Washington coming out of the Beal deal, and they need a lead creator because, again, can Beal and Booker technically do it? Yeah, they can technically do it. But imagine if they had an elite creator of offense and those guys could just be off the ball, off the dribble scorers. I just think that's really a potential championship needle-moving move to bring in somebody like Tyus, who's also shooting pretty well from three himself this season. He's picked it up after a slow start. So I'd like to see Tyus move to a championship contender for the reasons that you just mentioned. With him being just a really solid guy, it would be cool to see him being in that mix. A guy to root for as the playoffs approach, with Memphis almost certainly being out of it. From a Grizzlies perspective, I think John Konchar is gone. And maybe that's wishful thinking. If you've been following Locked On Grizzlies for a while, you know I've been advocating, not Damichael, I want to stress that. Damichael is a beat writer for the Commercial Appeal. He has opinions that aren't necessarily my opinions. It is I, Joe Mullinax, that have been advocating for John Konchar to be moved on from. He's a guy that just, in my opinion, doesn't fit what the team needs moving forward. Gigi Jackson, Vince Williams, those guys have kind of made that type of player not necessarily obsolete. It's always nice to have an end of the rotation guy that can help you in terms of depth if things get rough. Boston could still potentially, theoretically, use a John Konchar. The Cleveland Cavaliers could use a John Konchar. Teams like that, I think, would be really interesting to see if Konchar can fit in with. I could see Konchar being someone that is moved on from by the Grizzlies. And I'm curious to see what the Golden State Warriors do with Andrew Wiggins. I'm curious to see if the Lakers decide to stand pat on D'Angelo Russell, because Russell's played better of late, right? All this talk of LeBron James being impatient. Well, Russell's playing some of the best basketball of his career, at least of the last few years. So are the Lakers going to play that into, trying to make another deal to strengthen that group there in LA? That there is a potential for a flurry of activity. And if you remember last year correctly, Damichael, which I'm pretty sure you do, we had 12 trades on deadline day itself. So it could be pretty rapid fire pretty quickly.
Yeah. And John Konchar definitely jumps out to me. That's one where, just talking to people around the league, I've heard his name, a decent amount. You mentioned Boston. That I would not rule out the fact that, since Boston did a deal for Xavier Tillman Sr., I wouldn't rule out Boston for John Konchar.
But because Boston sent back Lamar Stevens, they still have, in theory, they can do some maneuverability with a roster spot.
Exactly.
Sort of things. Boston can still do some stuff in and around the deadline with their roster.
For sure. And a couple other teams. I think you mentioned the Cavs, but the Knicks are one to monitor.
Yeah.
The Indiana Pacers are another team. Just the Eastern Conference. I think John Konchar likely ends up in the Eastern Conference when all is said and done. Boston is definitely the team that's probably been monitoring him the most. I think the Knicks are probably somewhere in that range as well. But it'll be interesting to see if he's still on the team. In a way, it almost feels like at some point, and again, some of this stuff we're talking about it at the trade deadline, but some of this stuff will be resolved in the summer if you're just used to. It's just the way Zach Kleiman likes to work. Like he does his biggest stuff in the summer, and I feel like going into next season, at some point they're going to be choosing between Luke Kennard and John Konchar, not from the standpoint of which player is better, but which player makes the most sense in terms of what they need around their core from a financial standpoint, and then of course on the basketball side. So I don't expect both of those guys to be on the roster opening day next season. We could see if that's kind of decided at the deadline or if that's decided in the off season. But the Grizzlies got more moves to make, man. The Lamar Stevens is probably not going to stick around here too long. Victor Oladipo, like those are two spots that the Grizzlies will have open in the offseason.
And those are two guys that I don't think they can be aggregated with other salaries, but they can also be shipped out individually, right? Like Oladipo, that contract for the right 3-team deal Zach Kleiman is pretty good at that, positioning himself. Oh, you need a third team to get this done? Here I am. Look at this expiring contract I can help out with. So there's angles to be played for sure. Don't just assume that Memphis is done because they got some of their business completed on Wednesday. It'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. And make sure you're sticking with us here at Locked On Grizzlies. Again, Memphis makes a big deal. Damichael and I will get together. We'll do a quick 15-ish minute episode, get it out there as quickly as we can to talk about it. And obviously, we'll have an episode for you on Friday, recapping all of the craziness, as well as a Grizzlies game. I believe they play the Bulls tonight. No offense to Grizzlies Bulls. The Bulls should win, right? Spoiler alert. The injury report, all the trade stuff, it's not like it's getting that much better that quickly. So the Bulls are probably favored. They probably should win. But obviously, the trade deadline can shake up a lot of these things as well. So we got a lot to talk about on our Friday edition of the show as the time comes. Thank you so much for making Locked On Grizzlies part of your Memphis Grizzlies and NBA content consumption. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. We appreciate you being an everydayer. Maybe it's your first time checking out the show. Whatever the case might be, make sure that you're making Damichael and myself part of your everyday NBA content consumption. For Damichael, again, I can't stress enough, Damichael is one of the best, if not the best, covering the Memphis Grizzlies right now at Damichael C. Turn those notifications on. Get those updates from him. You can check out my stuff as well. We'll be giving all sorts of feedback and analysis, plus another episode summarizing it all on our next time out here on Locked On Grizzlies. For Damichael, I'm Joe. Make sure you are with us. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Enjoy your Thursday, and we'll catch you next time on Locked On Grizzlies. Have a good one.